Hi guys, I'm Eliza Wood. This is my channel, and let's talk about Alice in Wonderland undergarments. Now I'm going to be making cookies while I do this because I promised my boyfriend that I would make him cookies. So don't mind me being around in my kitchen while I talk about so far what we've worked on. So it's been 3 weeks since I started. There's been a change of plans. So I got recently some new books from Patterns of Fashion. I now have Patterns of Fashion 1 and 6, which happen to be the specific ones that are meant for the time period that we are working on. So I looked into those two as well as Patterns of Fashion 5, and apparently there is the court gowns in, I believe it was 1760 or something like that, somewhere in the 18th century. They did have a corset in the gown rather than in the as an undergarment. So for my sister's sake, because she's not going to want to wear too many layers, I have decided to do a court gown where the corset will be part of the gown rather than making an undergarment, which makes my life a little bit easier because I don't have to make an 18th century corset for either of us. I will, well, technically I kind of do, but later on I don't have to make a corset and a bodice. But that means I have a little bit of extra time, so I've decided to go ahead and make some panniers. I probably didn't say that right. So what panniers are is these cage skirt type pockets. They really only are a cage on the hips, but in the 18th century, again, they had wide hips, but not so much in the front or back. I might wind up doing a bum pad. I haven't quite decided because I can't quite figure out if they would have both the bum pad and the cage skirt. So I have to do a little bit of extra research into that before I decide for sure whether or not I want to do the bum pad. But that's just the change of plans. For now, let's talk about what we've actually done. So what I started off with is the smock.
Alright, so first things first, I need to prepare my fabric. So my linen here has already been in the wash, and I need to create a straight line that I can work off of so that my smock doesn't hang weirdly in any one way or another. So what I'm doing is, it's called pulling a thread, quite a literal name. You just take one thread from your fabric and you pull it all the way out through from one side to the other. And this is going to cause you to have a very visible opening in your fabric that you can use to cut a straight line on. So once I have my fabric cut out, I went ahead and made 2 rectangles, one for the front and one for the back. I just cut out the widths that I needed and left the width of the fabric. So in my case, it would have been a 52-inch width fabric, so that's the length of my smock. And then I drew out my pattern onto my fabric, which I'm seeing now that you cannot see. I don't know what made me think that you could see a pencil on white fabric from that far away, but apparently that's what I thought. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to leave you guys a link to the pattern that I used, which would probably explain this whole process to you so much better than I could anyway. But pretty much the pieces that I'm cutting out is the full front and full back, as well as you can see me cutting out a triangular piece on the side. This is half the length of the smock, and you're going to want to keep that because that is your gores for later on, which is going to make the width of the smock at the bottom much better, much bigger. I start the Red Queen off with the shoulder. Didn't take long, so I immediately went on to the gores. For the red queen, I started by sewing the two triangles together and would later sew them to the sides. For the white queen, I actually sewed the two triangle pieces to the sides before sewing a straight line down through both the sides and the gores. So before I sewed the gore into the side pieces, I decided to go ahead and fell this middle seam. I probably could have waited until the end, but I just thought it would be easier to go ahead and fell it now and then not have to worry about trying to deal with stitching around a seam later. Now, my seam allowance was very small. I did this on purpose. Apparently, they generally had very small seam allowances whenever they were sewing something like this, so I went ahead and kept with a very small seam allowance. But you still have to cut down the one side so that you can have the other side wrapped around and tucked under. Once I have both sides about the length that I need them to be and turned over, I can go ahead and start with the stitching. Now at first I start with just gripping the fabric in my hand between my two fingers, but this doesn't really give you enough tension to have a good stitch length. So what I do once I get those first couple of stitches and have enough body left, I wrap the fabric around my pointer finger and tuck it between my middle finger and my pointer finger, and also my thumb and my pointer finger. That gives me tension on both sides of the stitches, so I don't have to worry about pulling the thread too taut. And then finally I sew the gore to the side panels of the dress and close the dress, which gives me this. Clearly it needs a collar, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this ribbon in place. It's a pretty easy process. I've already sewn some holes into the fabric so that I can thread the ribbon through at the front. And now I'm just, in the same way that I was felling earlier, rolling my fabric over the ribbon, holding it between my fingers, and stitching it in place.
So I've come to a realization that's gonna make it a bit of an issue. The way that these close, or technically they're closed anyway, but the way that the smocks work is they have a really open neckline, and then you just tighten the neckline with some ribbon. And that works because it goes all the way around through the shoulder to the back. So you also have some tightening in the back. And that's going to be a little bit difficult when I have a two-part shoulder like I want to do on the other smock, so that I can, release it and put it down. So I'm trying to decide. Originally my plan was to still do this 1/2 inch overlap with a button to close it, but to do that, my ribbon wouldn't be all the way through. So my choices are to do the button and just have the ribbon connected in the front so I can tighten it in the front. And then just have the back just already gathered. Or I could have the ribbon go through front and back and tie at the shoulders. The problem with it tying at the shoulders is I have a very thin ribbon. It's a little bit thicker than this one, but it's pretty thin, and it's gonna kind of look weird for it to be tied here and not here. But what I could do is I could tie it here and then just put a button down here. In order to do that, though, I can't have any overlap because the tie would want to come out at the end of the fabric. Decisions. The smock wasn't that hard. It took a little bit of time, mainly because the smock goes right up against the skin. So in a lot of the gowns, they would leave the seams raw, and they would just let them kind of fray as they will. However, a smock was right up against the skin, so they had to fell the seams, I think for probably 2 reasons. One of them being it's just not uncomfortable to have those open seams against the skin, and the other one being that they had to wash them, and the more you wash, the more it frays. So I went ahead and decided to fell the smocks by hand. So that took a little bit of doing. I'm not super fast at felling. It's something I only just recently started doing, just sewing in general. So felling isn't the thing I'm best at, but that's okay. I got faster at it working on these seams, but I did use a sewing machine for the rest of it. Eventually, I'd like to be able to do completely historically accurate sewing, including method, but honestly, time restraints, not happening. I was able to sew 2 smocks of the same pattern. Turns out me and my sister had about the same size-wise for that. Smocks are pretty similar. I mean, there's not much change. They were super simple to make because you had to make so many of them. I think they were generally made by the person who was wearing them or their servants, whereas the rest of the gowns would be made by a dressmaker. The only real difference is that I'm a little bit taller than my sister. For mine, I use the width of the fabric as the length of the gown. It hits me about mid-thigh. However, for my sister, it hits her about ankle, and she doesn't want it that low. So we're gonna have to shorten her smock, which is a little bit sad because that means there's that much of some felling that I'm gonna have to cut off, but that's okay. So I haven't done that yet, but we did go ahead and measure how long she wants it. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut probably maybe like an inch below where she wants it to be so that I can do a 1/2 inch hem. The other difference that I have in both of the gowns, not the gowns, the smocks, is the collar area. They both have the same neckline, but with the White Queen, she doesn't wear sleeves, as I mentioned in the last video. She has her sleeves, well, she has sleeves, but they start down here. They don't cover her shoulders. And smocks were meant to cover your shoulder. I mean, smocks actually had sleeves on them. I wound up nixing the sleeves in my smocks because neither dress really needed them or wanted them. So for my sister, I went ahead and did the normal neckline. They would just have a really open neck, and then they would put a lace in the collar that you could pull and tighten the gown around yourself to make sure it doesn't fall off. And I believe that you could then loosen it if you had to tuck it in anywhere. However, my gown, because I can't have shoulders on, I went ahead and did something I think they may have done in the Victorian era, but I could be wrong. I did the kind of modular shoulder where you can undo the shoulder portion. And the way I did that is similar to the lace within the collar, except that I had the ties up here, and the only thing connecting the shoulder is up here. Now this wouldn't be structurally sound at all, so I couldn't wear this gown for long periods of time because that lace comes undone and the gown's gone. But I only plan on wearing it under a gown that's gonna keep it up anyway. So I'm not too concerned about having a not very structurally sound shoulder. Vanilla always smells so nice. Now once the smocks are done, it's time to start working on some of the other undergarments. Because I'm not doing a corset, the only undergarment I really need to make before making the skirt is the cage skirt at the Panniers, or whatever they're called, and possibly a bum pad as soon as I figure out whether or not it's actually used. So that'll go hopefully a little bit faster. Well, it did go a little bit faster, mainly because the pieces are so much smaller. It only really took me about a week to make a couple of panniers. Now there is a couple per person. So we have a white set and I'm working on a red set. So the video clips that I'm showing now are from the red set, except for probably the twill tape edition, so that I can get this posted before I finish the red set.
So unlike with most of the other garments that I've made from Patterns of Fashion or in general, a pannier is kind of just, it doesn't really matter what size you use. I mean, it kind of does, because it'll depend on how big you want your hips to be, but it's not based on your own measurements. It's based on how big you want your hips to be. The only thing that would be based on your own measurements is your waistline, but you use ribbon for that, so I'm not too concerned about that portion. So that's going to make my life so much easier. I'm just going to go ahead and size up the pattern from Patterns of Fashion 5 by 8 times what it was originally. So using white chalk, I'm going to go ahead and draw out each of my pattern pieces over my folded fabric and then just cut them out. And there you have all of the pieces off screen. So now it's time to go ahead and sew them all together, hopefully at a better angle than the smock video. Now it's pretty easy to sew these together. It's just really sewing the pieces together with the sewing machine. The only thing to keep in mind is that panniers are actually pockets, so you do have to leave a small opening on one of the edges that allows for you to have pockets. And at this place in the pockets, I'm going to want to fell my seams. Everywhere else, I went ahead and left the seams raw because it's not going to get washed. You're not going to wash anything with boning in it. But for the pocket seam, I need it to be felled or hemmed or whatever the word is, because you're going to be putting your hand in and out of it, and you don't want to get your hand caught on string every time you're trying to put it in your pockets. And what's a cage skirt without some boning? So I currently have some leftover boning from a corset that I recently made, and I'm going to go ahead and measure out the bones that the pattern calls for and just cut them out. Now don't worry, those are my kitchen scissors, not my sewing scissors. For the boning channels, I took a inch, I believe, strip of fabric and rolled it over a bone pretty much like I was going to fell it. And then I stitched it like I was going to fell it. Although I wasn't able to wrap it around my finger like I would want to, it really just was stitching these two pieces together. And I did it around the bones so that I could have as tight of a hold as possible and the bones would slip as minimally as possible. And then finally I can hand stitch the boning channels with the bones inside of them onto the fabric. Once again, really just using a whip stitch. And now we can switch over to the white panniers so that I can go ahead and put on the waist tape without having to wait to finish it until later. Now I'm not really sure how the waist tape is supposed to go on. What I went ahead and did is I sewed it on the one side, and then I realized for some reason that I had gotten my pattern pieces some sort of awkward different lengths in the front. So I went ahead and kind of gathered them together as best I could, and then I folded over the waist tape on top of the front and sewed it all throughout the machine because I wasn't going to bother with hand sewing at this point. And then finally, I went ahead and sewed one more round of waist tape just on the bottom edges of the panniers with hand sewing, just so that I could make sure that the panniers didn't stick out in any sort of weird way, and we could just tie it at the waist and at about the bottom of the hip.
It was quite interesting making the panniers. I made some mistakes on the first set that were stupid, and then I also made some mistakes on the second set that were stupid. For both the smocks and the panniers, I used linen. For mine, the White Queen, I used white linen, and then for my sisters, for the pannier, I actually used red linen. Now, I expected them to react the same way, be the same consistency and easy, and whatever methods I used on the first one, I thought would be used on the second one. I was not correct. Okay, so mistakes that I made on the first one. I only cut out one pannier at a time, and I went ahead and sewed the entire pannier before cutting out the second one. And linen is very widgy, so it moves. It doesn't like to stay still. I then tried to use, this was stupid of me, but I then tried to use the section that was cut out from the linen to measure out the section that I needed to cut out. And again, linen is widgy. It doesn't want to do that. So the pattern pieces for one side of my pannier is totally different from the pattern pieces of the other side of the pannier. I might be able to kind of sew the twill tape a little bit tighter around one side, because one side is wider than the other side, and if I use the twill tape to kind of make it a little bit tighter, hopefully it'll be okay. I'm hoping that it won't be too noticeable because one hip is bigger than the other or something like that. The other thing that I realized later is I'm thinking that I probably should have put the twill tape in before sewing the entirety of the pannier together. I actually found out that was probably the case after I finished sewing the panniers for the red one, so unfortunately the twill is going to be visible on both of them, but these are undergarments, so it's okay. Now for the second one, the mistake that I made is that I forgot to wash the linen ahead of time. Now, it's not a huge deal because the reason you're supposed to wash fabric ahead of time is if you plan on washing it later. I'm not gonna wash these panniers. They have bones in them, so they're just gonna be however they're gonna be. But I thought I was trying to draw the thread for the linen on the red fabric, and it kept snapping. So I was like, well, shoot, I forgot to wash the fabric, so I need to go ahead and do that. But at this point, I had already sewn the panniers together. So I was like, oh, well, it's fine. I'll just throw the fabric as well as the panniers without the bones. I hadn't yet put the bones in yet. I'll just throw them both in the washing machine. It'll be fine. It was not fine. The linen completely frayed. I am totally afraid that those panniers are just gonna snap apart when my sister's using them. I'm hoping they stay a little bit. I've done some stuff to try to keep the structure together, but it frayed down to the sewing. So I'm a little concerned for them. Gonna try to avoid any mishaps during the process, but I was so annoyed when I realized that I had done that stupidity. Now in the future, I probably will wind up washing the linen ahead of time. It didn't actually fix the thread drawing problem. It still snapped multiple times, and I had to give up on trying to do it the way, like, drawing the thread, I actually just picked the thread out of the fabric. But it did make the fabric a little bit less stiff, which is a little bit easier to work with. So I will probably do it in the future for fabrics like linen and cotton. I may or may not do it for the gowns because they're not really gonna be washed. At least the only plan is if they get like super dirty when we're at an event, then maybe we'll take it to a, oh gosh, who are those professionals who do the washing? I cannot remember. You know what I mean. I'll put it on the screen. So I'm gonna try to finish the twill tape on the white one before I post this video. It'll take me too long to completely finish the red one, but the white one is just waiting on the twill tape. So it'll be finished and hopefully I can show it off. And then in my next video, I will hopefully work on the skirts. I think that is the next step, is the skirts, or maybe possibly a bum pad. So I haven't decided on that one. So that's that. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys have any suggestions, constructive criticisms, or anything of that nature that can help me learn what I'm doing, because obviously I have no clue, please leave it down below. If you're interested in watching me try to figure out how to do the rest of this dress, go ahead and subscribe. If you like this video, like the video. Hopefully you guys come for the next video. I'll see you then. Bye!